She was 20 years old the day the bank clerks let her sign her name to a deed for a building nobody else wanted, and by then she had already learned that being let do something and being welcome to do it were two very different mercies. Her name was Josephine Larkin, and 2 winters before, her stepfather, Vernon Doyle, had turned her out of the house her own mother had died in, telling the neighbors that a grown, unmarried woman underfoot was a burden a widower with new prospects could no longer bear. She had $13 sewn into the hem of her coat, the whole of what she'd saved scrubbing floors and keeping books for the feed store, and with it she bought the old Cutter's Bend telegraph station, shuttered these 6 years since the rail company rerouted its line, for $4, and the promise to clear the taxes owed on it. It was a desperate, foolish little purchase, everyone agreed. A warped shell of a building with a dead switchboard and a roof full of daylight. But behind that switchboard, sealed where no lineman or tax assessor had thought to look, waited a message nobody currently living was ever meant to read. One that would not only give Josephine Larkin a life she could call her own, but would return to a forgotten corner of that county something it had been quietly denied for the better part of 20 years. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Josephine Larkin. If you've ever been let do something without ever being made to feel welcome doing it, we think you'll understand Josephine before this story is through. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if stories like hers are the ones you come here for, follow or subscribe to this channel so you never miss the next one. Josephine Larkin was born in 1878 in Cutter's Bend, a rail and cattle town strung along a bend of the Solomon River in the high plains of Kansas, in a small frame house that stood, in those years, close enough to the depot that she grew up falling asleep to the rhythm of the telegraph key clicking through the walls, a sound her father, Amos Larkin, made his living by. Amos had been the station's telegraph operator for nearly 15 years, a quiet, careful man who treated the machine at his desk with something close to reverence, and who taught his daughter, almost as soon as she could sit still in a chair, to hear the difference between the dots and dashes of ordinary freight schedules and the sharper, more urgent rhythm of a message that mattered. He was not a sentimental man about most things, but he was sentimental about the wire, calling it the nervous system of the whole country, a way for a farmer in Cutter's Bend to know, within the hour, what had happened in Topeka or Chicago or clear across an ocean, and he believed, with a plain conviction, that Josephine absorbed the way a child absorbs any deeply held family belief, that the person who sat at the key held a kind of sacred trust, that every message passing through his hands, whether it carried news of a birth, a death, a shipment of cattle, or a bank's business, deserved to be handled honestly and delivered exactly as it was sent, without alteration, without delay, and without anyone but its intended reader ever knowing its contents. Josephine's mother, Sarah, died of consumption when Josephine was 8, and it was Amos, in the years after, who raised her largely from the small side room of the telegraph office itself, letting her do her lessons at a corner desk while he worked the key, so that by the time she was 12 she could send and receive Morse code herself, slowly at first, and then, within a year or two, nearly as fast as her father, her small hands finding an ease with the key that surprised even him. He taught her, too, the discipline that came with the skill, that a good operator kept a log of every message, noted its time of sending and receiving with exact care, and never, under any circumstance she could imagine, read aloud or spoke of what a private telegram contained, because the wire's whole value to the people who trusted it depended on that silence being absolute. Josephine grew up then, not merely knowing Morse code as a party trick, but understanding it as a kind of moral inheritance, a discipline of exactness and discretion that her father wore as naturally as his coat, and that she came, without ever being told to wear the same way herself. The trouble that would eventually cost Josephine everything began quietly, in the way that most real troubles do, in the spring of 1893, when Josephine was 15, with the arrival in Cutter's Bend of a cattle and grain speculator named Elias Kettering, a smooth, well-dressed man who bought up struggling farms and stock contracts throughout the county in the panic years that followed. Always, it seemed, a step ahead of whatever bad news was about to strike a given family's finances. Amos Larkin, sitting each day at the one machine through which nearly every piece of urgent business news in the county passed, began to notice, in the quiet, private way a careful man notices things he cannot yet prove, that Kettering's fortunate timing was a little too fortunate, that he seemed to know about failing bank drafts and dropping grain futures before the men who held them did, and Amos began, almost against his own better judgment, to keep a private log of his own, not of the messages themselves, which he never once altered or delayed in his handling, but a record of dates and senders and the uncanny speed with which Kettering's land purchases followed certain telegrams through the office. He never accused anyone outright. He was, in this as in everything, a careful man, and he intended, Josephine would only learn much later, to take his suspicions to the railroad's district superintendent, once he had gathered proof enough to be believed rather than dismissed as a jealous or paranoid old operator. He did not live long enough to do it. In the autumn of 1894, riding home from the station on a night made slick with early sleet, Amos Larkin's horse startled at something in the dark and threw him, and he struck his head against a fence post, and by morning he was gone, and 16-year-old Josephine was left an orphan in a town where, within a year, her father's careful private suspicions about Elias Kettering had gone entirely unspoken, because there was no one left who knew to speak them, and no proof anyone had thought to preserve beyond whatever private log her father had kept, which, if it had ever existed at all, could not be found among his few belongings. Josephine went, after her father's death, to live with her mother's older half-brother, Vernon Doyle, a hog and grain trader on the far side of town who had married a woman named Ida with 2 young children of her own. And for the better part of 2 years the arrangement was, if never warm, at least tolerable, Josephine earning her keep by keeping Vernon's account books, a skill she had learned as naturally from her father's example as she had learned Morse code, and by taking in mending and doing wash for a few of the wealthier households in town on the side. But in the spring of Josephine's 18th year, Vernon Doyle's fortunes, like those of half the farmers and small traders in the county, took a hard turn. A poor harvest and a banknote called in early, leaving him badly strapped. And it was around this same time that he began, with increasing frequency, doing business with Elias Kettering, who by then owned the largest grain warehouse in the county and had become, in the years since Amos Larkin's death, one of the most quietly powerful men in Cutter's Bend, sitting now on the school board and the church building committee, a pillar, publicly, of exactly the respectability her father had once suspected him of counterfeiting. Whether it was Kettering himself who suggested to Vernon Doyle that a household could ill afford an extra unmarried mouth to feed, or whether Vernon arrived at the notion entirely on his own, Josephine never learned for certain. But the effect was the same. In the autumn of her 20th year, Vernon told her, not unkindly, but without any real regret in his voice either, that with Ida's own children growing and his finances stretched thin, he could no longer keep her, and that she ought to find her own situation. He gave her, as her father's few remaining effects had years before been folded quietly into Vernon's own household accounts, and never fully returned to her, almost nothing beyond her own clothes and the small tin of coins she had managed, carefully and privately, to save from her mending work, $13 in total, sewn for safekeeping into the hem of her good coat, which was, by that point, the entire visible measure of what Josephine Larkin owned in the world. She might, in those first desperate weeks after Vernon Doyle put her out, have gone almost anywhere else, taken a room at the boarding house until her few dollars ran dry, and then hired herself out as a domestic to whichever household in the county had need of a quiet, careful young woman willing to work hard for little pay. And this was, in fact, exactly the future most of Cutter's Bend assumed awaited her. But Josephine, walking one gray October afternoon along the rail spur on the edge of town, found herself standing before the old telegraph station itself, the very building where she had spent nearly the whole of her childhood at her father's side, shuttered and sagging now, its windows broken, its roof caved in along one corner, abandoned entirely since the railroad had rerouted its main line 4 years before, and left Cutter's Bend served only by a distant flag stop. The county, she learned upon inquiry at the land office, had been carrying the little building and its narrow parcel of ground on the tax rolls for years, unable to sell it to anyone with real money for a genuine purpose, and the clerk there, a tired, not unkind man named Otto Fenn, who remembered her father fondly, told her that if she could clear the back taxes owed, which came, all told, to just under $4, the building and its ground were legally hers, deed and all. It was, everyone who heard of it agreed, a foolish thing for a young woman with no prospects and no trade beyond mending to do with nearly a third of her entire fortune, to buy a ruin nobody else wanted, with no roof to speak of and no earthly use anymore, when that same $4 might have bought her another month's lodging while she looked for honest work. But something in Josephine, some stubborn thread of her father's own precision and quiet defiance, told her that the station was not merely a building. It was the one place in Cutter's Bend that had ever fully belonged to her family, the one place where her father's memory still lived in the very floorboards, and she signed the deed with a hand that did not shake, even though nearly everything else about her circumstances at that moment had every reason to. She moved into the station within the week, patching the worst of the roof herself with scavenged shingles and canvas, sweeping out 6 years of dust and nesting birds, and setting about, with the same careful discipline her father had taught her over a ledger, to make the place livable before the first hard frost. It was on an afternoon in early November, while she was prying loose the warped, water-damaged paneling behind the old operator's desk in hopes of salvaging the boards for patching the roof, that her crowbar caught on something that was not simply rotten wood, a section of the wall behind where the telegraph switchboard itself had once stood, a narrow recessed cavity built, she realized as she worked more carefully, not by accident or decay, but by deliberate construction, fitted with a small hinged door, disguised so precisely within the paneling's grain that she would never have found it at all had the wood around it not already been failing. Her father's old habits rose in her without her even summoning them, the same instinct that had once taught her never to leave a discrepancy in a ledger unexamined. And she worked the little door open by lamplight to find, tucked into the shallow space behind it, a metal dispatch box of the kind railroad offices once used to secure important papers overnight, its lock long since rusted but not, she found, beyond opening with patience and a thin blade. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept the worst of the damp away, she found a leather logbook bearing her father's own careful, familiar handwriting on its spine, and beneath it, folded separately, and marked in a hand she did not recognize, a single yellowed telegram, flimsy, its message still faintly legible, addressed to a name Josephine had never heard before, and signed with initials that meant nothing to her at all. And it was this small, ordinary-looking scrap of paper, more than anything else. That would eventually unravel a debt to the town of Cutter's Bend that had gone unpaid for nearly 20 years. Josephine spent 3 full evenings by lamplight working through her father's logbook. And what she found there, entry by careful entry, was the private record he had begun keeping in the last months of his life. The very evidence, she now understood, that he had died before he could ever bring to light. In neat, dated columns, Amos Larkin had recorded the passage of telegrams concerning grain futures, bank drafts, and land transactions throughout the county across nearly a full year, cross-referenced against a second column noting, in his own careful shorthand, the dates on which Elias Kettering had subsequently purchased failing farms, foreclosed grain contracts, or distressed livestock herds. The pattern between the 2 columns so consistent, so damning in its repetition, that even a reader with no head for numbers could see what her father had seen, that Kettering was not simply a shrewd businessman anticipating hardship, but a man acting on information from telegrams that were never meant to reach him at all. Private financial dispatches between the county bank, its debtors, and outside creditors, messages Kettering had somehow been reading, or having read to him, before their intended recipients ever received them. The telegram flimsy tucked beneath the logbook, once Josephine examined it closely against her father's notes, proved to be the single clearest piece of evidence in the whole cache. A message originally sent from the county bank in Salina to Cutter's Bend's own bank manager, a man named Wallace Pruitt, concerning the exact terms on which a struggling rancher named Silas Odom's note would be called if payment did not arrive within the month, a message that, according to her father's log, had been received and properly delivered to Wallace Pruitt on the 14th of March. And that, according to the county land records Josephine consulted at Otto Fenn's office days later, Elias Kettering had ridden out to make Silas Odom a very particular, very well-timed offer for his ranch on the very same afternoon, a full week before Pruitt's bank had ever formally notified Odom that his note was in danger at all. It became clear to Josephine, piecing the log against the land records late into those November nights, that this had not been a single lucky guess, but a pattern repeated across at least a dozen families throughout the county over more than a year. Each one losing land or livestock or savings to Elias Kettering at a price far beneath its worth, each purchase following, by mere days, a private telegram Kettering had no legitimate right to know the contents of at all. Someone inside the telegraph office itself, working alongside her father, must have been quietly copying or relaying the contents of certain wires to Kettering before or alongside their proper delivery. And her father, discovering it, had begun building his case in silence, rather than raising an accusation he could not yet prove. A silence death had made permanent, until a 19-year-old girl with a crowbar and her father's old instincts had pried it back open by accident. The name that finally explained the mechanism of it all came to Josephine almost by chance, a week later, when old Otto Fenn, hearing that she'd found some of her father's effects hidden in the station, mentioned, in an idle, sympathetic way, that the fellow who'd briefly worked as her father's assistant operator in his final year, a young man named Garrett Shull, had left Cutter's Bend rather suddenly not long after Amos Larkin's death, and was last known to be working a telegraph line down in Dodge City. Josephine remembered Garrett Shull only vaguely from her childhood, a quiet young man her father had trained and, she now recalled with a chill, had once mentioned with unusual reserve in his final months, and when she wrote, carefully and without revealing all she knew, to the telegraph office in Dodge City inquiring after him. She learned, through a reply that took nearly 3 weeks to arrive, that Garrett Shull had died of typhoid 2 years prior. But that the office manager who answered her letter, an older man who had known Shull in his final months, mentioned that Shull had spoken, more than once and with evident guilt, of a debt of conscience he owed to a family back in Cutter's Bend, though he had died before ever making it right. It was not, in the end, a confession Josephine could present to a court, a dead man's second-hand guilt relayed through a stranger's letter, but combined with her father's meticulous log and the surviving telegram flimsy and the pattern of land records at Otto Fenn's office, it was more than enough to tell Josephine, with a certainty that settled cold and clear in her chest, exactly what had happened in Cutter's Bend in the year before her father died, and exactly who had profited from it, and exactly how far that man's respectability now stood on ground that was never honestly his to build upon. Word travels quickly in a small town, and it did not take long for Elias Kettering to hear that the Larkin girl was living out at the old station, asking peculiar questions at the land office, and writing letters to Dodge City about a telegraph operator dead these 2 years. He came to see her himself on a cold December afternoon, arriving in a fine covered buggy that looked almost absurd parked before Josephine's patched and leaning little station, and his manner, when she met him at the door, was smooth and almost paternal, the manner of a respected man addressing an unfortunate girl he assumes he can easily reassure. He offered first to buy the station and its ground from her outright for $30, a sum that would have seemed a fortune to most anyone in her position, and that he clearly expected would settle the matter cleanly. When Josephine, keeping her voice as steady and as carefully neutral as her father had once kept his telegraph key, declined, Kettering's tone cooled by careful degrees, and he suggested that whatever old papers a grieving, over-imaginative girl believed she had found in a ruined building were almost certainly worthless. The confused scribblings of an operator whose judgment, he noted with practiced regret, had perhaps not been as sound in his final months as people remembered, and that a young woman alone in the world, with no family standing and no protector, would do well not to make an enemy of the man who sat on the school board and held the note on half the farms in the county. He reminded her, gently but unmistakably, that Vernon Doyle still owed him money, and that debts, like reputations, had a way of coming due at inconvenient times for the families of people who caused trouble. He left without ever raising his voice, and Josephine stood in the doorway of her father's old station and watched his fine buggy roll away down the frozen road, understanding fully now that she was in a contest with the most powerful man in Cutter's Bend, armed with nothing but a dead man's logbook, a single telegram flimsy, and a second-hand rumor of guilt from a man who could no longer speak for himself. She did not fight him alone for long, though it took her the better part of a hard winter to find the allies who would matter. She went first, carefully and with real fear in her chest, to Wallace Pruitt, the bank manager named in the telegram itself, an aging, cautious man who had spent 20 years quietly uneasy about how badly his bank's reputation for discretion had been undermined during those years without ever having proof enough to say so. And when Josephine laid her father's logbook and the surviving flimsy before him on his own desk, she watched something in his careful banker's composure crack open, with what looked almost like relief. The relief of a man finally handed permission to say aloud what he had long suspected. Pruitt, in turn, brought her quietly to Silas Odom, the rancher named in that very telegram, an old, weathered man who had spent 19 years believing his own poor luck and poor judgment had cost him his family's ranch, and who wept unashamedly when Josephine read him her father's dated notes, proving that his ruin had not been chance or failure at all, but a private message stolen from the wire before it ever reached the men whose money and land it concerned. Word moved carefully, but steadily after that among the dozen or so families her father's log named. Families who had spent 2 decades believing, each in their own private shame, that they alone had simply failed, and who now gathered quietly in Wallace Pruitt's own bank parlor on a snowbound evening in January, began for the first time to compare their stories aloud and recognize, family by family, the same pattern Amos Larkin had died trying to prove. The reckoning came, in the end, not in a courtroom, for Elias Kettering was too careful and too well connected a man for the county's thin evidence to convict him of anything beyond suspicion, but in the far more damaging court of the town's own opinion, called into session on a February evening at a public meeting of the Grain Association that Kettering himself had, in a bitter irony, helped found and long presided over. Wallace Pruitt, standing before that room with a banker's careful authority no one could easily dismiss, read aloud the telegram concerning Silas Odom's note and its precise, damning date, and set it beside the land record of Kettering's purchase of the Odom Ranch 1 week before Odom himself had ever been told his note was in danger, and then read a second such matched pair, and a third, and a fourth, each drawn from Amos Larkin's careful log, until the room, family by family, recognizing its own quiet old shame, reflected suddenly as something done to them rather than something they had failed at, turned decisively and irreversibly against the man who had built 2 decades of respectability on wires he had no right to read. Elias Kettering did not go to prison. The law of the time and place was not built to reach a crime committed so quietly and so long ago, and Garrett Shull, the one man who might have testified directly to how the copying had been done, was 2 years in his grave. But Kettering resigned that same week from the school board and the church building committee, and within the month, facing a wave of quiet, coordinated withdrawals, and called in favors from families who no longer trusted him with so much as a friendly transaction, he sold his warehouse and most of his county land holdings and left Cutter's Bend altogether, never to return. And the Grain Association's board, in a vote taken not long after, established, at Wallace Pruitt's urging, a restitution fund drawn from the proceeds of Kettering's hasty land sales to compensate, as fairly as 20 years' distance allowed, the families his stolen telegrams had ruined. Silas Odom's family chief among them, finally able to reclaim a portion of the ranch that had been theirs before a private wire meant only for a banker's eyes had cost them everything. It is worth remembering, now that Josephine Larkin asked for nothing from that restitution fund herself, though the grateful families of Cutter's Bend pressed her more than once to accept a share of it, telling her plainly that without her father's careful log and her own stubborn refusal to leave a locked door unopened, none of them would ever have understood what had truly been taken from them. What she asked for instead, once the winter's reckoning had settled into a kind of hard-won peace, was simply to keep the old telegraph station and to reopen it, with the town's modest help, as a proper working office once more. Since Cutter's Bend, even served now only by its distant flagstop, still had farmers and families glad of a place to send an urgent wire without riding half a day to the county seat. She sat, in the years that followed, at the very desk her father once worked, behind the very switchboard that had hidden his last, unfinished truth, and she kept, above that desk, the original telegram flimsy that had unraveled it all, framed simply and without ceremony. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder that a message honestly kept, even for 20 years in the dark behind a wall, will find its way eventually to the hands that need it. Josephine Larkin had been let out into the world at 20, with $13 and no one's blessing, and what she found, in a ruin nobody else wanted, was not a fortune for herself, but a truth her father died trying to tell. A truth that, once finally spoken aloud, gave an entire forgotten corner of that county back a portion of what quiet, patient dishonesty had taken from it years before. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with us and with Josephine's story tonight. If her patience and her father's quiet integrity moved you even a little, we would be so grateful if you'd hit follow or subscribe to this channel so that you never miss the next story like hers when it arrives. And we'd love to know, in the comments below, what is a time you found real value or real truth in something the rest of the world had already written off and walked away from? We read every one of your stories, and we treasure them. Until next time, stay close.